I stand before you today not to boast of a bank balance, but to share a revelation, a transformation that began not in the world outside, but within the silent corridors of my imagination. I did not inherit a fortune. I did not stumble into luck. What I inherited was a story of scarcity, of struggle, of ceilings placed gently but firmly over dreams. And like so many of us, I was taught to admire success from a distance, as something reserved for others. But something stirred in me when I realized that every condition I called reality was simply a reflection of my inner assumptions. That's when the shift began. I decided, no, I assumed, that I was the first millionaire in my family. Not someday, not when the evidence showed up, but now here internally. I took my place in that reality before it had the courage to take its place in my world. What followed was not magic, it was law. A law as precise as gravity. And today, I'm here to explain not only what happened, but how it happened, so that you, too, can become the first in your lineage to rewrite the narrative of wealth, not by force, but by conscious creation. Let us begin. Everything that exists in your external world was first born in the invisible realm of thought and imagination. Every dollar, every opportunity, every door that opened for me began as a simple inner image, a quiet, persistent vision that I allowed myself to feel and believe. The truth I discovered is this: imagination is not a child's game. It is the creative force behind all of life. When used consciously, it becomes the tool by which we build new realities. I grew up in an environment where money was always a problem, not a solution. There were whispers of limitation in every conversation, a quiet agreement that we had to settle, to be realistic. But within me lived a question that refused to stay silent. What if this reality isn't fixed? What if it's only reflecting what we've agreed to believe? That question led me to the realization that the world around me was simply mirroring my inner assumptions. If I could see poverty and limitation on the outside, it meant they first existed on the inside. So I began to change what I saw within myself. I would sit alone and imagine. I didn't wait for evidence. I created the evidence in my mind. I pictured myself living the life of wealth, not as a fantasy, but as a truth. I would walk into rooms in my imagination as a millionaire. I would hear others congratulate me. I felt what it would be like to bless my family, to say yes to opportunities without hesitation. This wasn't about pretending. It was about entering a state of being where the millionaire version of me already existed. I met him in imagination long before I met him in the mirror. Imagination, when used deliberately, reorganizes the unseen forces that govern the visible world. It begins to shape circumstances, rearrange relationships, and align you with the right timing. But most importantly, it changes you. And once you shift internally, reality has no choice but to comply. You do not wait for the world to change before you believe. You believe, and the world rearranges itself to match that belief. This is not theory for me. This is lived experience. The money came after the mindset. The breakthroughs came after the inner picture became real enough to walk around in. I stopped being surprised by success because I had already lived it within so many times that it felt normal. Becoming the first millionaire in my family didn't begin with hard work, networking, or even opportunity. It began with imagination, sacred, powerful, disciplined imagination. And once I learned to wield it with intention, my reality couldn't help but bend to my vision. To become the first millionaire in my family, I had to learn the secret that every lasting transformation begins within. I had to assume the feeling of the wish fulfilled. That meant I could no longer wait for circumstances to give me permission to feel wealthy, successful, or free. I had to feel it now, before the bank account showed it, before anyone believed in me, before there was even the faintest trace of external proof. This is the foundational truth I discovered. Emotion is the bridge between imagination and manifestation. I realized that simply visualizing wealth wasn't enough. I had to enter into the experience emotionally. I had to feel what it would be like to already be the person I wanted to become. This required a kind of inner discipline, an emotional loyalty to a version of myself that the outer world had not yet recognized. It wasn't easy at first. I was surrounded by reminders of lack, bills that were due, obligations I couldn't fulfill, people who echoed doubts I secretly carried myself. But I understood that reality was not a fixed condition. It was fluid, responsive, and shaped by inner conviction. So I asked myself daily, what does it feel like to be free? What does it feel like to wake up and know that money is not a worry but a tool? I didn't just think about the answers. I sat with them until they became real sensations in my body. I felt the relief. I felt the security. I felt the power of having choices, of being able to bless others, of no longer being confined by limitations. I allowed those feelings to take root and grow, even when logic screamed otherwise. The more I practiced this inner state, the more natural it became. I noticed how differently I walked, how I spoke, how I responded to life. I wasn't pretending, I was becoming, and from that state new ideas began to flow. Unexpected connections appeared. Solutions I had never thought of before became clear. The external world started to bend, little by little, to match the emotional reality I had committed to within. It wasn't about faking it. It was about faithfully assuming it. The more I stayed loyal to the feeling of the wish fulfilled, the more life conspired to meet me there. I wasn't chasing the million. I was embodying the state of already being one who had achieved it. And because I stayed in that state, opportunities that once seemed impossible began to unfold naturally. Becoming the first millionaire in my family didn't happen by chance. It happened because I dared to feel the result as real before it arrived. I stepped into that reality internally and allowed it to shape me from the inside out. In doing so, I discovered a timeless principle: that which you feel yourself to be, you inevitably become. I was not born into wealth. I was born into a cycle. A cycle of limitation, of just getting by, of dreams deferred for the sake of survival. This was the silent agreement passed down through generations, that money was scarce, that life was hard, that big dreams were for other people. And yet, within me, there was always a quiet refusal to accept that story as final. I began to see that if my reality was shaped by the ideas I inherited, then changing those ideas could alter the course of my life. That realization led me to one of the most powerful discoveries of all. I could break the family pattern by changing the inner conversation. Every day we speak silently to ourselves. These inner conversations are more influential than we realize. They form the blueprint of our self-image and eventually our reality. I began to observe mine. I noticed that even when I tried to move toward success, a voice inside would say, "Who do you think you are?" Or, "That's not for people like us." That voice wasn't truly mine. It was borrowed from generations of struggle, pain, and well-meaning limitation. I realized I had been repeating internal scripts that did not belong to the millionaire I wanted to become. So I began the work of rewriting those scripts, not by force, but by repetition. Instead of rehearsing doubt, I started speaking from a place of truth, the truth I chose, not the one I inherited. When I walked into a room, I internally affirmed, I am worthy of wealth. I am a blessing to those around me. I am the first millionaire in my family, and I lead with wisdom and grace. These words weren't just affirmations. They were declarations of identity. And the more I repeated them, the more they began to feel real. The breakthrough came when I stopped waiting for external validation and made the decision to be the author of my internal world. I realized that family patterns are not curses. They are simply habits of thought passed down, like heirlooms. But just as we can put down an object we've inherited, we can also lay down limiting beliefs that no longer serve us. I didn't reject my family. I simply chose a new story for us, a story that begins with me. As I shifted my inner dialogue, my energy changed, my choices changed. I started seeing possibilities where before there were only walls. And eventually the world responded. Opportunities opened, resources flowed, and people began to see in me what I had learned to see in myself. Breaking the generational cycle of financial limitation did not begin with money. It began with mastering the conversation I was having with myself. By changing the words I spoke silently in my mind, I created a new pattern, one of abundance, power, and purpose. And through that inner transformation, I became the first millionaire in my family, not by chance, but by choice. Faith is not hoping things will work out. Faith is the inner conviction that they already have. That was one of the most liberating truths I learned on the path to becoming the first millionaire in my family. Most people think faith is about waiting for signs, waiting for results, waiting for life to prove something. But true faith is a stance. It is unwavering loyalty to the unseen reality, to the version of life that exists within you before it appears in the world. There were many moments when my outer reality gave me every reason to doubt. My bank account didn't reflect wealth. My surroundings still echoed the past, familiar struggles, old fears, people who doubted what I was doing. But I had made a decision to remain loyal to the image I had built in my mind. I chose to identify not with what was visible, but with what was possible, and not just possible, already real within me. Faith is not passive. It is not a quiet whisper in the dark. It is an active state of being. Every morning I entered that state intentionally. I walked in it, spoke from it, made decisions from it. I didn't check my current conditions to decide how I felt. Instead, I asked myself, what would a millionaire believe right now? How would they act, respond, or think in this moment? And then I did my best to move from that place, even when doubt tried to creep in. What I learned is that faith rewires your focus. When you're loyal to the unseen version of yourself, the version who has already succeeded, you begin to see things differently. You start to recognize doors where others see walls. You become sensitive to subtle opportunities, divine timing, and inner guidance that pulls you forward. Faith sharpens your vision to notice what the old version of you would have ignored. People around me often thought I was being unrealistic. But what they didn't understand was that I was no longer shaping my reality from the outside in. I was creating it from the inside out. My inner world became more real to me than the current facts, and slowly the facts began to change to match that inner conviction. This is not delusion. It is spiritual discipline. It is training your consciousness to hold its shape even in the face of contradiction. It's easy to believe when the money arrives, when the praise comes, when everything falls into place. But the real power is found in believing before it happens, knowing that your assumption is already taking root in the unseen. Loyalty to the unseen is not weakness. It is strength beyond measure. Because when you remain faithful to the inner world you've created, the outer world has no choice but to align. That is how I lived. That is how I became. That is how I stepped into the life of wealth, not by watching and waiting, but by trusting and knowing. One of the most powerful shifts I ever made was this. I stopped acting towards success and began acting from it. That change in perspective transformed everything. Most people live in a constant state of striving. They see the dream as something far away, and every action they take is rooted in trying to reach it. But what I learned is that when you act from the state of already being the person you desire to be, your life reorganizes around that identity. When I said, I am the first millionaire in my family, I didn't mean it as a future goal. I meant it as a present truth. I stepped into that state internally and started living from it. That meant thinking, speaking, moving, and deciding from the mindset of someone who had already achieved that success. This was not a game of make-believe. It was a process of inner alignment. I asked myself every day, how would the millionaire version of me respond to this challenge? What choices would he make? How would he carry himself in this moment? And then I practiced being that version, consistently and deliberately. This wasn't about being dishonest or pretending to be something I wasn't. It was about stepping into the truth that already existed in the unseen, the truth that everything I desired was already mine in consciousness. The more I identified with that version of myself, the more I began to behave like him naturally. I carried myself with calm confidence. I made decisions from abundance, not fear. I said no to things that didn't serve that higher version of me, even if it meant temporary discomfort. People around me noticed the shift before the money ever showed up. They said things like, "You've changed," or "You seem different." And the truth was, I was different, not because my circumstances had changed, but because my self-concept had. I wasn't working hard to become someone new. I was simply expressing the version of me that already existed internally. That version had always been there. I just needed to access it through conscious assumption and sustained awareness. The actions I took from that state had a different energy. They were not desperate or uncertain. They were firm, focused, and aligned. The opportunities I attracted were a reflection of who I had become, not who I was trying to be. And that's the key. You don't manifest what you want. You manifest what you are. And what you are is determined by the state you live from. I didn't hustle to become a millionaire. I became one in consciousness, and then my life followed suit. Acting from the state is the bridge between the invisible and the visible. It's not about forcing results. It's about embodying the identity and letting reality conform. That's how the inner world becomes outer truth. That's how transformation becomes inevitable. Becoming the first millionaire in my family was not a matter of luck or sudden breakthrough. It was a result of persistence in the unseen. Once I assumed the identity of wealth, once I imagined the reality I desired and accepted it as mine, I had to stay there. That's where most people falter. They visit the state of success but don't live in it. They declare their desires once or twice, but then return to old fears, doubts, and limiting stories. What I learned is this: persistence in the assumption rewrites destiny. This journey wasn't about doing something once and expecting immediate results. It was about returning again and again to the inner reality I had chosen. Some days were easier than others. There were moments when the outer world showed no signs of change, when I felt like I was walking through fog, moving towards something I couldn't yet see. But in those moments I reminded myself, my job is not to force outcomes. My job is to remain faithful to the state I've already claimed as mine. Persistence is not stubbornness. It is quiet, steady certainty. It is the refusal to let temporary appearances dictate eternal truth. Every time doubt whispered, "You're not there yet," I answered internally, "I already am." Every time I felt like giving in to old patterns of fear or lack, I gently returned to the feeling of wealth, abundance, and ease. It wasn't a battle. It was a discipline, a gentle returning over and over. What surprised me was how reality began to respond to that inner consistency. Slowly at first, but then unmistakably, life began to shift. Unexpected opportunities came, ideas formed with clarity, and I started to take inspired action. Not from desperation, but from alignment. The more persistent I was in holding the state of being, the faster things unfolded around me. It wasn't that life suddenly became easy, it was that I became stable within, and from that stability I became powerful. When you persist in a chosen state, no matter what shows up externally, you prove that your inner world is the true authority, and the world responds in kind. You will see people treat you differently, resources show up where none existed, doors open that once seemed sealed shut. But all of this flows from the invisible work, the daily, hourly practice of remaining in the assumption of the wish fulfilled. You do not become a millionaire and then act like one. You act from it, persist in it, and reality follows. I am living proof that the unseen shapes the seen, that repetition becomes reality, and that those who remain loyal to their inner vision will see it manifested in time. Not because of chance, but because of law. Persistence is the bridge between imagination and experience, and when you walk that bridge daily, unwaveringly, you step into a life that was once just a dream, but now is your reality. And so I stand before you, not as someone who stumbled into wealth, but as someone who consciously created it. I did not break free from generational limitations through force or luck. I did it by mastering the unseen, by assuming a new identity and remaining loyal to it when everything around me said otherwise. I imagined it, I felt it, I lived from it, and I persisted in it, until it hardened into fact. I became the first millionaire in my family, not because I chased money, but because I aligned with the consciousness of wealth. I reprogrammed the internal dialogue that once whispered limitation and replaced it with truth. I became emotionally faithful to a vision that existed only in my mind until the world caught up with it. I stopped waiting and started assuming. I stopped wishing and started being. This is not just my story. It can be yours. The same power that worked through me works through you. Your imagination is not passive. Your feelings are not random. Your inner conversations are not background noise. They are the builders of your world. You do not need permission. You do not need the past to change. You only need to change the state you live from, the moment you decide who you truly are, and remain loyal to that inner state. The world begins to shift in your favor. Be the one in your family who changes everything, not just for the money, but for the liberation, for the legacy, for the generations that will look back and say, it began with you, because it does. You are the seed, you are the cause, and when you claim the truth of who you are, wealthy, worthy, whole, life will not deny you, it can't, because it must reflect what you assume yourself to be. And that is how I became the first millionaire in my family. Not by accident, but by law.